We're back.
Hello!
Hello!
La la la. Welcome back to me. Hi everyone.
I was
Monday.
getting a little too comfortable.
You were definitely, he definitely like had his like.
I didn't wreck the desk.
You man spread all over this. You man spread all over this place. It is Monday night generational change. I'm Jen.
I'm Peter, and the new format starts this week. So you are going to be seeing us regularly on Mondays, as always, and Thursdays. Why are we doing Thursday now instead of Monday?
We're doing Thursdays because we've been constructively evicted from our Wednesday time slot by due dissidents, friends Keaton and Russell.
That's not the only guys,
no,
but they just happen to be
But we are going to lead into the Gen Z report, which is going to follow us on Thursdays, and I think that might be the boost that they need. And so, yeah. But basically, Wednesday was just getting a little too competitive.
Yeah, we're glad to have our 9 p.m. time slot on Monday still open. We will figure out an exact time that will work for Thursday. We are also in the process of adding Rockfin as part of our live stream. So rather than Twitch, which, you know, let's face it, we're not video game players here. We're not talking from certain angles.
As much as you keep trying to get me to go do gaming things,
maybe someday you might actually.
I'm not a gamer.
Well, we're going to take a trip back in time today to where there was no such thing as any electronics whatsoever. There were just your wits and your hands and your brain.
Honestly, I appreciate that. I do. And
not for dysentery.
No. But I was going to tell you, I'm even okay with the shorter lifespan. I really am. I actually would prefer simple and shorter. I would. So I'm good with that. Again, you know, I'm not like going to be like old, but you know.
Well,
you know.
For those of you who probably have been living under a rock, and there are many, there's this thing called endless war here in the United States. And if we're doing proper calculation, honest calculation, since the inception of our nation, when we officially became a country, and this is including the American Revolution, we have not been at war in one way or another for about 14 years of our history, 14 to 16 years, something in that range.
It's small.
It just so happens that the war we're going to talk about tonight preceded one of, if not the longest extended period in our nation's history when we were not at war. It was known as the era of good feelings. Now, how much of that actually was led to because of this war, we are going to find out tonight.
See, I'd much rather live in the era of good feelings than in the United Corporations of America and the climate inferno, as Jordan Sheraton calls it.
That is true. And yes, Jai Bird, war is a racket for the most part. There are times where war has been necessary, however, slightly.
Let me tell you something. The day that the Russians and the Chinese are pulling up on the shores, I'm all for defending. I'm all good. That's when it happens. But so long as we are over in up their butts, it's not defense. See, that's the thing. It's not a defense department. It's the offense department. And I do find it quite offensive. So, yeah, anyway. I digress.
Rest in peace to Pee Wee Herman.
Pee Wee Herman died?
He died today. So,
no. He got a raw deal. He got screwed over.
He did. And we will get into that later today because Jen knows about this story, like,
I'm very familiar with that story, and I was also a fan of Pee Wee.
Yeah, so was I. I mean, listen, Pee Wee's Big Adventure scared the living daylights out of me when I was about 4 years old because, of course, I couldn't take the clown. But I'm just saying. Okay.
Because you know that one of the biggest jokes in San Antonio is about that there's no basement at the Alamo, and it is based on the fact that, and in fact, there is even a sign at the Alamo that there is no basement.
How much you want to bet that was probably something that happened to Tim Burton? Like he went there and thought that there was a basement at the Alamo, and the joke was on.
I don't know. I'm just telling you that there is a sign at the Alamo saying there is no basement. And that is totally from Pee Wee Herman.
Well, tonight we are going to go back to a time before the Alamo even existed. We are going to go back to a time during what would be considered the birth of our nation. No pun intended, of course.
And basically our second Revolutionary War.
It was our second Revolutionary
War. I understand now.
And it was a war that probably should have been avoided altogether. But it is also the war, believe it or not, that we came much closer to losing. And there are many reasons as to that. And there is only one person that we could possibly think of. I did the research. I found out that there is a gentleman, recently retired professor at Wayne State University in Nebraska. I happen to know it because
you know everything about
did the
school
college
athletics
fundraising. And so this little school in the heartland of America, there is a professor who is basically known as the connoisseur, if you will, the guru of the War of 1812.
It's a really good niche.
It is. It's a great one because very few people really know about it.
You know, like I wanted to be a Third Amendment specialist coming out of law school.
You will quarter me if I ever need help. So let's just let you know that. At a time where it would be interesting also to know how they value the Constitution. Former retired. Professor Don Hickey, welcome to Generational Change.
Thank you. By the way, it's Wayne State College in Nebraska. Wayne State University is in Detroit.
You know what? Forgive me for making that mistake. And of course, I didn't. That's also Wayne County, Illinois. That's a good point. So my apologies. I didn't put the banner up yet, so that would make me look pretty silly if I made that mistake. But you are a professor, so it's always important to get it right.
Thank you so much for coming on. I mean, obviously, you know, we are all but very familiar with the constant state of war. And it really is interesting to me to think back that there actually was a time when that wasn't the case. And I didn't realize that that's what that was the era of good feeling. And so, like, where were we that we were able to get to that? Like, what had to happen to get to that? I guess that's what I'm interested in. How can we do that?
Well, I think two things happened in 1815. The war in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars ended, and that embroiled us in, depending on how you count it, 2 or 3 different wars between 1798 and 1815. And the War of 1812 with Great Britain ended. Tecumseh's War with the alliance of the Pan-Indian Alliance forged by the great war leader Tecumseh came to an end as well. And so that sort of greased the skids for a period of peace, at least for a time.
And, you know, something else, obviously, is we had Indigenous people, both here and what is also now Canada. There are people that's rude.
Why?
Okay. That were divided and fighting on behalf of either, you know, I know in the Revolutionary War, there were a lot of Indigenous people that fought for the crown thinking, oh, this will somehow help us. And yet it didn't. And then there were the people that have sided with the colonists. And I think that didn't we see that again in 1812, that we still saw like both us and the other European countries basically using the Indigenous people to fight this war?
Well, the British did indeed forge an alliance with Tecumseh and his allies during the War of 1812. But alas, the British abandoned the Indians at the end of that war. And as a result, they were left at the mercy of the United States. The British, after that war, actually changed their whole foreign policy. Their objective in the New World was how to defend Canada against an aggressive expansionistic United States. And they had lined up Indian allies for the War of 1812, decided they just couldn't do that, and they couldn't pump enough money into the defenses of Canada to make it safe from the United States. So their policy thereafter was to accommodate the United States. And we see that throughout the 19th century, and it bore fruit. There was an Anglo-American Accord in the 1890s that turned into co-belligerency in World War I, and then a full-fledged alliance in World War II that is in place today.
So let's take a trip back in time. This is a time period that is basically a generation post the revolution, and the country obviously is coming into its own. But of course, we've pretty much only expanded about a third, if at most, across the continental U.S. And there are many potential obstacles that are there. But I think an important place to start, and one that a lot of people are not really familiar with, is the role that Native Americans played in the war in 1812 and what later led to some of the most horrific historical circumstances in our nation's history, like the Trail of Tears. What ultimately led to the beginning of this war as it relates to the involvement of our Native Americans?
Land. Jefferson, as president, was determined to establish American authority and secure land in the West. And between 1803 and 1809, his hammer in the West which was a young William Henry Harrison, who was the territorial governor of Indiana and also Jefferson's chief Indian agent, oversaw a series of treaties that deprived Native Americans in the Old Northwest of about 25% of that territory. And the Indians became increasingly unhappy with this pressure on their land. And the upshot of this was the outbreak of Tecumseh's War at Tippecanoe in November of 1811. And that marked the beginning of this warfare that blended into the War of 1812. And there's an old song about the War of 1812 that goes like this. Everybody's happy with the outcome. Americans are happy because they think they won. Canadians are happier because they know they won. And the British are happiest of all because they've forgotten all about this conflict. The only belligerents that it ignores is the Indians. In the Old Northwest and in the Old Southwest, they were the big losers in this war.
Yeah. I mean, that seems how it always is. That's how it is for all the marginalized people that we sort of like conquer. It always is worse for them. Somehow we rebounded, them not so much.
That's true. And this is a common pattern. Before the great powers of Europe ever got to America, the Indians were overrunning one another. There was kind of a low-level state of war between neighboring tribes. And the reason there were always some good Indians who welcomed the European colonists is they feared them less than they feared some neighboring traditional enemy.
There is definitely the reaction was certainly not surprising because of the fact that the United States, the United Colonies, if you will, was not regarding any type of, there was essentially no such thing as sovereign land. And so it was not surprising that the natives chose to support the British going into this conflict. And I would assume, based on your historical research, that there is a direct correlation between the natives supporting the British during the war and what would ultimately come as a result afterward of continued westward expansion, but ultimately the pillaging of Indian land for about a century.
Well, I think that would have happened anyway. The westward movement had gained huge momentum, even by the time Jefferson became president in 1801. And however unprincipled his policy of trying to force the Indians off their land was, this movement was underway and he was just trying to control it. Nobody could control it. So whether we went to war against Great Britain or not, whether the Indians allied with Great Britain or not, this pattern was likely to continue in the years throughout the 19th century.
Yeah, there's nobody that was here that wasn't going to try to take what was theirs. There's nobody that would have been here and not just gone across. Anybody that would have come here with firearms is going to use those and take what they think should be theirs.
Well, what I find interesting is that Canada, with a much more benevolent government and Indian policy, their reservation shrank and their Indian population shrank. It was not as rapid as what occurred in the United States, but the pattern was similar, and that was with a benevolent government who sought to look after the rights of the Indians.
What happened to them now? Because Canada is not so great on a lot of this now.
Well, Canada, like the United States, has reservations, and Indians enjoy a lot of basic rights. And I suspect their government perhaps is no more benevolent than ours. Ours has tried to take a more favorable view toward the Indians, and I think there's actually a legal precedent that when you look at the treaties that were signed, if there's some doubt about who was in the right, the courts have leaned in favor of the Indians, realizing that they probably had not given a very good explanation of what was occurring in the treaties.
I think it goes without saying that one of the biggest misconceptions of Thomas Jefferson is the man that more or less, wrote not just our founding document, but the man that he ultimately was as president. I don't think he was a good president. I think that there is this perception that he somehow was, but it seems that a lot of his actions also led to this conflict that ultimately came to pass under Madison.
That's true. Jefferson is one of those odd presidents. You've got a lot of the positive. His first 4 years, great success. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. Peace and prosperity. The nation was doing pretty well. But in his second term, the British and the French stepped up their war on our trade. He tried to combat it with the embargo, which was a disaster for the U.S. economy. He aggressively pursued his Indian policy. He rejected a favorable treaty with Great Britain, which might have taken us down the road to peace and prosperity instead of the road that led to commercial sanctions and war. So we've got a real mixed bag with Jefferson, a great first term, very successful president, but for my money, a disastrous second term.
That sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah, a lot of presidents throughout history
Yeah.
seem to, especially the ones that get reelected, typically don't have as bright of a second term
No.
as the first one.
I see Woodrow Wilson and Lyndon Johnson sort of in the same category. And if you're trying to rank or judge the presidents, it's tough to know what to do with those guys. You know, where do you put
No,
them?
it isn't. I've said this before. It's like choosing what disease you want. It's not. It's just it's all bad.
It's interesting.
Well, no, I would argue that both of those guys had very successful, all three of them, very successful first terms. But their second terms, in my view, were pretty disastrous.
No, and I'm just talking about
interpretation.
these people. I'm just talking about these people and what their priorities are and who they're really out for and who they're really not helping. And it's pathetic.
Well, we also have a very checkered history that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. You know, we have, there's nothing wrong with being prideful and being an American. There are a lot of great things about our nation, but there's also a lot of dark history that we kind of want to sweep under the rug. We're having that issue here in the state of Florida where we have a governor that really wants to sweep history under the rug and pretend like it's not happening.
Prager University is now part of our school curriculum in this state.
Yeah, that's dangerous. And, knowing the
That's
history,
crazy to me.
but also knowing the history of this particular conflict is something that I really don't think a lot of Americans know. And I know we're going to jump around in a couple of different directions, but no one bared more of what I would consider an historical benefit in terms of their image, if you will, than Andrew Jackson. It is in many ways what preceded his ability to become the first non-founding father to, or at least connected to, where John Quincy Adams falls, but to me, he was the difference. He was the change, the serious change in our governing history when he became president, and also what ended up happening to him when he ran for president the first time, when he really won. But that's neither here nor there. What is his history? What is the real history of Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812, specifically the Battle of New Orleans?
Well, Jackson made his reputation in the Creek War. The culminating battle in late March of 1814 was a decisive victory over the Creeks, and he followed it up with a treaty that extracted, I forget what it is, something like a third or a quarter of their lands, friendly Creeks and enemies alike. And that's really set him up to assume responsibility for the defense of the Gulf Coast and New Orleans when the British invaded. And he did a great job of defending New Orleans and emerged as a great national hero. That set him up to be elected president.
That war, in that particular battle, is, I think, in many ways, there were so many different components as far as what the British were able to do in terms of, again, burning down Washington, D.C.
Not exactly. They burned the public buildings. That's about 5% of the property in the city.
Which is amazing when you think about it. Obviously Dolly Madison, of course, was heralded for her role in saving the very famous portrait of George Washington, which I believe was the first portrait ever hung in the White House and is still to this day. But the fact that the British were able to advance so far into our country, how close did we actually come to losing this war, would you say, at least compared to the Revolution?
Well, the British definitely had us on the run in 1814 because the Napoleonic Wars came to an end in April when Napoleon surrendered and abdicated and was sent off into exile in the Mediterranean. So the British could devote their resources to the American war, but they were not as successful as they anticipated. And in spite of all the cries for punishing the United States, the British people were war weary. They'd been fighting wars and paying war taxes for 20 years. And by late 1814, they just wanted to end this war. And so ultimately, though they made a series of demands, they surrendered them all and agreed to a treaty on December 24th, which returned to the status quo ante bellum, which was in effect saying the war never really happened. And once we ratified that treaty on the 17th of February, 1815, that brought the War of 1812 to an end.
Nothing happened.
Yes.
So nobody got anything. That's the key.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Nobody got anything except the Indians. They got the short end of the stick because the British abandoned them in the peace negotiations. And they had repeatedly told the Indians, we will look after your interest in negotiations. There was talk of establishing a barrier state in the Old Northwest, a permanent Indian reservation. The British actually demanded that at the beginning of the negotiations in August of 1812, but then eventually they retreated from that and their other demands, and the Indians were simply abandoned.
Of course they were.
And why do you think that was? At least from the British perspective.
Well, the Indians were very useful for helping the British defend Canada against the United States, which had a population about 15 times the size of Canada. But once Canada was safely, I think, defended, the British were willing to end the war, and taking care of looking after the interest of the Indians was simply not a core policy interest of the British. So they saw no reason to continue the war on behalf of the Indians when they had secured what they felt was a satisfactory settlement.
I feel like there's so many conflicts we're in where it ends the same way. There is no satisfactory settlement. Nobody really gets anything. And the people that are native, indigenous, local, the regular people, they just suffer. And nobody really gets. I feel like that's what's going to happen with Ukraine. I feel like that's what's happening everywhere. It's conflict for the sake of conflict, and nobody seems to be getting anywhere.
Well, wars are certainly unpredictable, but there have been some good wars. The Civil War certainly kept the Union together and ended slavery. World War II put an end to fascism and Nazism. So I don't think we can dismiss all wars as being ill-advised and wrong-headed.
Definitely agree with that.
We haven't had one since World War II. That's what I think. I think since that, it has just been about the military-industrial complex, and that it's now just a matter of that's our business. War is our business, and business is good.
There's also something to be said for technological advancement and what that means. Discovering different means for resources. 210 years ago, it wasn't like that. We didn't have fast moving ships. We had, ships that required wind to sail. We didn't have these tactical armies with rapid fire weapons. You had muskets. You had to reload every time you shot. It was a completely different time. Granted, there's also something to be said, as Jen has pointed out, to living in a time period where you had to be more resourceful. I've always said, and this is something I'm sure you've experienced in the many years as a professor, technology is our greatest asset and it's our greatest detriment at the same time. Now, while it's advanced us in many ways, it's also made us much less resourceful in the ability to deal with, let's say, some form of warfare, especially in the prospect of, again, the War of 1812. What was so significant about it? Well, it was technically the last war in which a foreign nation advanced on our territory. That does not happen. And what would happen today if we were facing something similar to that? I'm not quite sure. But I do think that there is something to be said regarding how we've advanced technologically versus how we've regressed in many ways. How do you feel about that?
Well, I guess I would say in defense of the British invasion of the United States, bear in mind when this war began, we invaded Canada. And at least in principle, the notion was we would seize Canada, which Jefferson said would be the conquest of which Jefferson said would be a mere matter of marching. And then we'd use it for kind of ransom to secure British concessions on the maritime issues, because those were the real causes of the War of 1812. The British attempt to tamper and limit our trade with Napoleonic Europe, and the British practice of removing seamen from American merchant vessels to fill out the crews of their undermanned warships.
It sure sounds to me like almost every war in our nation's history has to do with something along the lines of it always being about money and being about power. There really is no other reason.
Well, perhaps so. That's a pretty large statement to make, and maybe you can make that argument about most wars. I think a war to the War of 1812. I'm not a fan of that because I don't think that war was winnable. We just couldn't. We couldn't conquer Canada. We couldn't defeat the British and their Indian allies, and we didn't. But there are other wars. You can argue that World War I, we got involved in April of 1917 in order to defend our prosperity because German U-boat warfare was targeting any ship supplying the Allies in Europe. And you can make a credible argument that going to war to preserve your prosperity might be a legitimate reason to go to war.
Yeah, I don't doubt that there's actual reasons. I just feel like ever since we have created the behemoth industrial complex that we have, we seem to go poking around everywhere, finding conflicts. It's almost like we'll go, I always say it's like we're the annoying little brother in the back seat that's just sitting there like this. And then eventually the big brother does something and then we're like, oh my God, look what you did. And I feel like that's what we keep doing everywhere, consistently, in people's business, in their governments, unseating their leaders that we claim are not actual legitimate leaders, and just being the world police. I feel like we're looking for conflict.
Well, the most recent string of wars is certainly not hard to attack and not easy to defend. The biggest problem is they haven't been very successful. When you have a short and successful war like the Mexican War or the Spanish-American War, it's unlikely to generate too much domestic resistance or opposition. But those wars have been few and far between of late. I guess the first Gulf War was certainly short and sweet.
Yes, and it was interesting because, and I remember that very clearly. You do not.
Yeah, I do.
I'm going to be little. But, you know, because I feel like Bush Sr. was smart enough to know that, okay, you got him out of Kuwait. Let's stop it right there. We're not going to go any further. We really ought not to. And I'm quite certain that he wrote like a whole paper about this. And then they just sort of were foaming at the mouth to have a second go at it.
All right.
Well, war is very profitable.
Well, yes.
Now, I can imagine the War of 1812 didn't necessarily result in that. But throughout history, we've seen that there's always an end game in mind, you know, regarding why these wars are taking place. And I'm curious from your perspective. They say that Napoleon Bonaparte is the greatest, you know, war general that's ever lived, based on his strategies, his effectiveness as a commander, what he's been able to accomplish. But I'm not sure many people really understand what a role he played in the War of 1812 and how things ultimately evolved based on his decision-making. Can you comment to the degree that you understand what role Napoleon ultimately played in the outcome of that war?
Well, Napoleon kept the British busy in Europe, but keep in mind that his invasion of Russia was disastrous. It probably turned the tide in that war, and he lost the last great battle in the Napoleonic Wars to the great British general Wellington at Waterloo in June of 1815. Now, that came after the War of 1812 had been over for several months. But there's an old saw, the British lose every battle but the last one. And that was certainly true in that war.
Yeah, and though if there's one thing many nations have not learned over the years, it's not smart to invade Russia. It's really not.
Yes.
It doesn't seem
and who knows, maybe the Ukraine will find out, and we'll find out, that the Russians, whatever their liabilities or problems waging war right now they have pretty good staying power, and they might just outlast the opposition in that war.
That would be one of the first things that I would say to any naive American. when they're thinking about Ukraine winning this war with Russia. There is no winning this war with Russia, and the problem is that they are collateral damage. The Ukrainian people are collateral damage, and they are suffering for reasons that should not even exist. I am curious as to, being such a history buff when it comes to war. Do you have an opinion one way or the other regarding NATO? Is that something that you ever discuss as far as its positives versus negatives?
Well, I really thought NATO had outlived its usefulness with the end of the Cold War, but that proved to be not correct with the reemergence of Russia and probably other threats around the world. What I find out about the war in the Ukraine is it's supported by the left, and those who seem to be reluctant to support it, even though they're not very vocal, is the right. And that's kind of the reverse of what one usually sees in American wars. Usually the lefts are sharply critical of wars that we support. And the right, runs up the flag and supports it. But why does the left support this war?
Well, are you being rhetorical? I mean, because they're very funded by the military-industrial complex. I could say that our representative, who is a Democrat, she hasn't met a war she hasn't liked ever. So it's very interesting to me. Basically, the complex has bought both parties. And so that's what they're doing. It's almost like they keep giving the Pentagon more money than they ask for, which is, to me, absurd.
I think that there's two reasons here specifically, and you can probably channel your youth regarding what the environment was like during the war in Vietnam and relates to what the circumstances is like right now. And I think that there's two key differences. Number one, liberals are perfectly fine with this war because it doesn't involve their kids.
And it's not here.
If their kids were involved, you better believe that their tune would change. But that's the selfishness of the liberal. Then on the other hand, you have the significant portion of the, let's say, the right, the libertarian right, and the Trump right, which are against this war, mostly because this is a generation that went through the war in Iraq, and many of them lost family members, and they know to this day that that war was absolutely BS. It had no reason to happen. And so they're looking at this endless war complex that we've been living in, and because they were much more of the, we are going to fight George W. Bush's war in the Middle East, and were lied to about it, they see the scam that's being run on them now, and they're like, oh, this ain't happening. And the second that President Biden starts teetering on the point of, maybe we'll send a few thousand troops over there, they're like, oh, we're not doing this. What are you, crazy? So I think that if there is a surface level explanation as to why the reaction, if you will, to this war is happening the way that it's been happening, that would seem the most logical to me.
I would also suggest, now I sound like Bo, I would also suggest that people in this country tend to be more concerned about countries invading other countries when the countries that get invaded are white. And the fact that this is a European country and that it's like that is more, that's too close to home. You start getting involved in what's going on in like Sudan and whatever, nobody cares.
I think what's happening in Yemen is twice as bad.
Absolutely.
And no one is addressing that because Saudi Arabia,
Well, and again, it's not the same people.
How do you see it?
Well, I don't see how this line of argument explains why the left supports the war. Unless it's because
I know why the Congress people support the war is because they're funded. I mean, like Debbie takes money from Lockheed and Northrop.
How about the common left-leaning citizen, the common liberal?
They have been conditioned to believe that they have to help the Ukrainian people, and that Russia and Putin are Putin's the bad guy, and he invaded this country, and we must save the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian people must be saved, and we stand in solidarity with them. So we're going to hang a Ukrainian flag outside of our house, because this is what the sort of, I hate even calling that the left, because I feel like I'm actually the left. I don't know who they are. They're center. They're like left of center, maybe.
Well, I also think that there's this fear that, again, this is not to say that Putin isn't who he is. Putin is without question a dictator of, in some cases, the worst order. But there's also something to be said for going along to get along. there is an inherent fear, particularly in left politics, to not go against the grain.
Well, I'll also tell you, if you watched MSNBC in the past few years, you've seen nothing but anti-Russia, red baiting, Rachel Maddow screaming, Putin, 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 that they have the left so riled up and fearful of Russia that it's like putty in their hands.
Okay, guys, how about the War of 1812? You want to talk about that?
Yes.
So what were some of the long-lasting effects of the war? Because one of the things that became pretty clear is that once the war ended, you entered more or less into the era of good feelings, which is one of the only time periods in our nation's history where we were not at war. It actually has only been for, I think, like 15 or 16 years of our nation's history that we weren't at one way or another involved in some type of a conflict. Why did the era of good feelings more or less follow the War of 1812?
Well, the key was the war in Europe ended in 1815, and the war in America ended in 1815. The American people were able to turn inward and westward, but from the outbreak of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, at least when Britain entered the war in 1793, there was this really worldwide conflict, and the United States, with a far-flung trade, simply could not evade encroachments on our rights. Once that war in Europe ended, those encroachments on our rights ended. And the American people didn't have to worry about that, and they turned inward and westward, and we ended up with the so-called era of good feelings.
And that lasted for about, X amount of years. I think it was like 10 or 12 years. It lasted all throughout Monroe's presidency. And then it kind of like tailed off, but I agree. I think that it's like these highs and lows period, but they don't really last. That's what history has taught us. Is there a reason why you think it lasted for the length that it lasted? Because we look at all of the future conflicts, there's these very, very brief gaps in between when another war ultimately starts, or conflicts that never really necessarily have a beginning or an ending. Was that like a time period that you thought could have led to something much more productive as a nation? I mean, ultimately, there was a succession of different things that led to the Civil War, but there was this time period where things were heading in the right direction. Is there anything that you could pinpoint where you think that things really did go off the rail and we were out of the era of good feelings?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that the era of good feelings refers to this period when we didn't have a two-party system. The Federalist Party faded away after the War of 1812. Its resistance, its opposition to the war was actually popular during the war, at least in New England and some of the other middle states. But once the war ended, it sort of was a real liability to have been an anti-war Federalist. So we entered in this period. The presidencies, the final 2 years of Madison's presidency, 8 years of Monroe's presidency, in which it was really only one party, the Democratic Republican Party. Now that changed in the election of 1824. When you have no parties or one parties, you end up with multiple parties. So we had all these viable candidates in the election of 1824, and I think that really marked the end of the era of good feelings. But it really is a term that doesn't refer to the fact that we weren't involved in any wars, but rather that we were in a period in which there was not a two-party system intensely vying for power.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I feel like now you've just sort of vindicated my thought, where we're always hearing people talk about third parties. We need more parties. I actually like the idea of no parties. And I think the fact that you just said that was better. And then as soon as there were more parties, there was more conflict. So what is that like? I don't know.
Well,
I think that's interesting.
You bring up a really great. No,
there was one party rather than no parties. The Democratic Republican Party, what became the Democratic Party. But my mentor once said, when you have only one party, you're going to end up with multiple parties, because that party is going to split apart. And that's exactly what happened in the election of 1824. And eventually we settled back into the two-party system.
I wish they would have kept multiplying. I kind of feel like every time like people like gain perspective or there's new ideas, it's sort of like that should be a new sect or a new branch. Like we see it with so many things. And yet for some reason, these two parties have stagnated so long.
Well, if you think about the most impressive leaders in our nation's history, they generally came into power as a result of a cataclysmic circumstance, like the Great Depression for FDR, the assassination of a president to get, in my opinion, the best president we've had in Teddy Roosevelt, out of the governorship in New York, and he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Lincoln became president as a result of a very similar situation that would ultimately thrust Jackson into the White House. But the election of 1824 was a very unique inflection point in our nation's history, because as we've seen, especially today, there is a lack of trust in the electoral process. And that was an election where it was not decided by the people or the Electoral College. It was decided by the House of Representatives, which, as you said, was one party dominated, hence why John Quincy Adams became president. I don't know how much research you've done during that particular time period, but I'm willing to bet that there was a major split in this country when the man who had the most electoral votes and the most popular votes was not elected president of the United States.
Correct. The Democrats felt the election had been stolen from them, the Jacksonian Democrats, and they came back and prevailed in the next election. But that's not the only election decided by Congress. The election of 1877 was decided ultimately by a panel chosen by Congress. And it seems to me the election of 1800 was decided by Congress. So that's not entirely unique, that election.
Yes, I agree. Well, I would also say that the effects of the election in 1824 didn't have the same effect as what ultimately came as the grand bargain of the election of 1876. And there have been other elections throughout our history that have also resulted in wide splits in our nation. But I definitely agree with your perspective and Jen's as well that, the two-party system is what seemingly creates the greatest amount of divide in our country. And you have leaders that, and I use that term loosely,
I was going to say,
that come along and they take full advantage of the divide, whether it's the red team versus the blue team, conservatives versus liberals. We were involved in a local election, volunteered for a very nice gentleman who is the mayor of our town right now. And of course, it's a nonpartisan race. And what you learn is
it was glorious.
Yeah.
It was so glorious canvassing for a nonpartisan race. It was just like everybody was so much friendlier in general with us. It was unbelievable.
The most MAGA red voter and the most vote blue, no matter who voter, could agree on the same candidate.
It's amazing.
Just remove the party law, remove the R and the D from the name, and it's amazing how agreeable most people are. And I would assume you've probably experienced something to that degree as well.
Well, Nebraska actually has a unicameral, nonpartisan legislature. Though, in fact, I think people are aware of party labels, and the divisions tend to be along party lines in the unicameral.
Right. So it's there. It's just not officially there, which is sort of what we see. Like, people find out who they're voting for, if they align with them, then that's generally, they're going to vote on that party, even though it's a nonpartisan race.
Well, I would put it a little differently and say that it's a nonpartisan race, but people whose candidates who express views that you share, you're likely to support, and it may turn out to be those are the views of your party.
Right.
I also think when you remove the party label, it allows people to be more likely to expand upon their thought process for that particular candidate. Oh, he's a Democrat, I can't listen to him. Oh, he's a Republican, I can't listen to him. And that, I think, has been the major shift in many ways. The country goes through many different party alignments over the years, but we've been pretty consistent in terms of where the blue line is and where the red line is between the heartland and the South, the upper Midwest versus the Great Plains region, the West Coast and the East Coast, Northeast, of course. And it's been that way for a while. And we definitely need a shakeup. There's no question about it. And I think the more we learn about history, the more we learn about the importance of how we got to where we are, If we don't learn about it, we are doomed to repeat it, and we certainly don't want that to happen. Professor, it's obviously been great to have you on this evening. You mentioned that you have a book coming out in the fall, so please share it, and we would love for people to read up more upon your work.
That book is called Tecumseh's War, The Epic Conflict for the Heart of America, and it's about what I call the last great Indian War, the last time Indians in North America had an opportunity to win to really win a war and shape the future of the continent.
And that's
CUM.
T-E-S-E-H?
Yeah, Tecumseh. I would argue he was the greatest war leader in North American history. And I think there are other students of Native American history who would agree.
Very cool.
Guys, I begrudgingly recommend you going to Amazon, but in this case, make the exception. Please go and make sure that you sign up to get your first copy of Tecumseh's War, Conflict in the Heart of America. And of course, follow all of the wonderful works of Professor Hickey. He has written extensively on the War of 1812, but specifically on our American history that tends to be forgotten. And that is very important. Everyone can write a book on the Revolution, the Civil War, World War II. There's a lot of conflicts. There's a lot of history, rich history in our country. That is important to know. And that is why we were very happy to have you on this evening, Professor. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
We definitely hope to communicate with you again down the road.
Good. Well, thanks for having me, guys. I enjoyed it.
It's a pleasure. Have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See, what we're providing here is an actual education as opposed to, PragerU education.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the true sins of.
We're going to have somebody on and really talk about that. We have to have somebody on that we need is Florida. You could see if Chef.
Well, I messaged Marina and she said that Chef probably would be interested in a conversation like this, so that would be good.
Okay, we need to get a Florida legislator on here and talk about this, because this is a problem and it's going to need, we're not going to get any solutions from Tallahassee. So we're going to need to come up with some local solutions to combat this sort of forced teaching of ignorance on our children. So I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but we need to come up with a plan.
So there's a reason why our numbers are getting absolutely throttled tonight. Unfortunately, there's a major guest on a major channel.
Never mind.
Yeah. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is because one of the main talking points on this other person's show with the major guest is somebody that Jen would like to speak to regarding the state of Israel and how the Zionist perspective about why it is justified that Israel conducts business on behalf of the Jewish people that they do, when in reality what they're doing is making things exceptionally worse, especially from an anti-Semitic perspective.
Yeah, my thoughts are, well, it's interesting. Like I'm watching somebody like our representative basically call him out as anti-Semitic, which is absurd. Okay, RFK Jr. is not an anti-Semite. I not even a little think that. However, she yet is the biggest Zionist that we have down here, basically. And she is calling him an anti-Semite, and yet I'm finding what bothers me about him is the level of Zionism that he seems to be promoting. And so I would really very much like to talk with him about this. I think he really needs to speak with some of the Jews in Jewish Voice for Peace, whether it's me or some of the people that are actually in charge of Jewish Voice for Peace. But I feel like he is someone that might be receptive to education and reason. I would love to connect him with Rabbi Brant Rosen, who we have had on our show. There are numerous educated people within the Jewish community that would be very happy to speak with him about this. And it bothers me that he is going with basically talking points that are directed by non-Jewish people, whether it's this administration or it bothers me. I think he needs to be educated on this. And so I'm offering an opportunity to discuss this with him.
This is also one of the biggest problems with Wasserman Schultz calling RFK an anti-Semite, as is often the case in many instances when somebody is called an anti-Semite, is they want to over-exaggerate how much they love Israel to prove that they're not an anti-Semite. Well, actually, if you don't kowtow to the Israeli lobby, you're actually showing how much you do love the Jewish people. The Israeli lobby is well aware of the hatred that is directed at the Jewish people as a result of their belief, because that's all it is, it's a belief, that they are the chosen people and that they are better than everybody else. And so by that extension of we can land grab all we want simply because we are a democracy in the Middle East. That is a justification for this, again.
But to me, when I hear him talking like the way he's been talking to me, and even this administration, quite honestly, I don't see them addressing the Trump move of the embassy to Jerusalem. I don't see them really. So really, they're all on the same page. That's what this says to me. They're all on the same page. And by the way, there is absolutely no way at this point for there to ever be a two-state solution. So anybody who's in the Democratic Party that has that either on their policy platform or whatever it is, they're blowing smoke up your ass. That's not possible. That can't happen. We are so far past that at this point.
Yeah, we're not getting to a point where you could have a two-state solution considering all of the... It's much like the two-party system. If you have a two-state solution, how long do you think it would take before the two states were at war with each other?
That's not the bigger issue. The bigger issue is that Israel has made it impossible to create two states because of their illegal occupation of the West Bank and other such things, and their complete violation of international law, so on. And so the way it is set up right now, the way that the territory is set up, there is no viable way to create two states, which is exactly why Israel did what they did in where they occupied. They created a checkerboard situation so that it can never be a state. That was the point of what they did. And we funded it, and we're still funding it, and we just sit there and watch it. And then call anybody who speaks out against it anti-Semitic. That's just not, I'm done with that. Again, newsflash for the people, and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. Judaism and Zionism are two completely different things. Completely different things. Judaism was around long before Zionism, and it'll be around long after. And quite honestly, that's where we need to be moving. Zionism is white supremacy.
We're obviously going to make a clip of this so that the RFK people can hear about this, but can you please share exactly why this whole movement preceded World War II and the Holocaust?
Oh, yes.
And how the Holocaust was used as a political tool for the Zionist movement to get exactly what they wanted.
Yeah, I mean, for sure it was. And I actually think it's even more nefarious than that. I actually believe that there is a connection between the U.S. rejecting boatloads of Jewish immigrants that were trying to escape, refugees.
Oh, yes.
I think there is a very strong connection with our rejecting them in cahoots with the Zionists in the Western European Zionists. And make no mistake, the Zionism movement is a white European settler colonialism movement. It is not about Jews. They use the Jews to do what they're trying to do. And that is what I feel infuriated about as a Jew that feels like I was used in promoting their agenda. And the way I know this is if you look at how in Israel, non-white Jews are treated. If you look at how Palestinian Jews, and here is something that is a newsflash for people. Yes, there are Palestinian Jews. Guess what? There were Jews that were living in the area long before there was the state of Israel. There were Jews, there were Christians, and there were Muslims. There were probably other people too, but let's just focus on the big three. Everyone was fine. There wasn't any issues. They were all Palestinian. Everybody had their little tribes. Everybody was doing their thing until the white Euro Jews decided that they need this to expand their settler colonialism territory. And then once the Holocaust happened, they played on that. They played on those fears and they used it. And I do believe in conjunction with the United States and other allied forces to be able to finally create the Zionist state of Israel. It had been started in the late 1800s. Maybe early 1800s. And it comes from, is it Hungary, Germany? And it was from Theodor Herzl. He is the name of the European Jew. And it has always been their thing to have like this settled land that they somehow feel entitled to. And the Jews that were there, the Palestinian Jews, were just as discarded as the Muslim Palestinians and the Christian Palestinians. See, that's how you know it's not about Jews. It's not about Jews. Now, they'll go to places like Ethiopia and they'll import the Jews under the guise of, we're saving them. We're rehoming them to the promised land. We're saving them. Yeah, you're saving them to go to Israel and be second-class citizens just so that you can have enough numbers of Jewish population to maintain a majority and suppress the Palestinians. So it's not about Jews. AIPAC has said repeatedly, we are not about Judaism. We are about Zionism. And that is the truth. They are different things.
And one of the reasons why it was important to have Professor Hickey on this evening to talk about one of the forgotten periods in our nation's history, the War of 1812, is also the forgotten history of World War II. And that, of course, is for several years, the Nazis were trying to just get the Jews out of Europe. And the United States refused to accept them. And so ultimately, the final solution, which was crafted in the winter of 1942, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the Nazis knew that there was only going to be so much more time that they would have as some type of a reigning empire. Because remember, there were two things that happened in the winter of 1942 that changed the entire outlook of the history of the world, quite frankly. You had the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor at the same time that the Nazis were trying to invade Russia and got stopped about 10 miles from Moscow. And as a result, the war changed in a matter of months. Whereas if you look at what the world map looked like 2 years into World War II, it did look like the Nazis were going to take over the world. But in terms of what ultimately happened, the acceleration of the final solution, the 4 or 5 million Jews that ultimately were murdered in the span of about 3 years, this could have been avoided, I don't know how significantly, but probably to a great degree, if the United States was willing to accept some type of a refugee program for Jews in this country, because what would have happened as a result is other nations would have followed suit. The United States might not have been the global dominant superpower it became as a result of World War II. However, they were still one of the 3 or 4 leading nations in the world at that time. And by their decision to say, F them, they're not coming in here,
they literally sent back the boats.
So the decision to just exterminate them didn't happen immediately. It was something that ultimately they decided, well, we don't want them. We don't want to deal with them. They will not be a part of the 1,000 years of the diamond of Europe, fantasy that the Nazis were selling to their people in 2 parts of Europe. Instead, what they did was give them an opportunity to get lost. And when that didn't happen, they decided, well, we're not going to live with you. So I guess we're just going to have to kill you. So it's not like there wasn't something that led to it. This perception, this historical recreation of the Nazis just wanted to eliminate the Jews and the benevolent Americans had to come in and save them. It's not true.
No. The Nazis did want to eliminate the Jews.
Sure.
They didn't care how. They didn't care one way or the other how. They were going to do it either way. They were genocidal. Now, whether or not they did it from letting them leave versus exterminating them, that was sort of played out in different ways. And it happened over a period of time. And there are lots of different stories in that. But the point is, the United States wasn't offering up any help.
No. And again, this is the big problem when people start talking about the Palestinian people, and RFK was talking about how there's, I guess it has to do with Hamas, and it isn't I forget what the specific term is if you martyr yourself in their culture, pertaining to, like what happened on 9/11 and things like that.
Right.
But what they're really talking about is if you kill a Jew, you're like paid handsomely or something like that. You don't think that all of that exists like all over the world?
Here's something that I find very interesting, and this is from talking to people that I know that are Palestinian. I actually have a friend here who's Palestinian who still has family there. I know a few people, and here's the thing. They don't hate Jews. They hate the state of Israel. And quite honestly, I don't blame them. That's who's making it so they get electricity maybe a little bit here and there. They don't get fresh water. They don't get to travel on highways. They can't go and come as they please. They're being completely policed and patrolled. And it's like, so if you're going to now say that they hate Jews because they hate their oppressor, well, you're again conflating the state of Israel with Jews. And unfortunately, that seems to be something we do hear more. I do not find that Palestinians have an issue with Jewish people. I don't find that at all. I find that Palestinians have an issue with their oppressor.
Our resident conservative friend Metalopoly wants to know, what is the Talmud and what does it teach? Is it true that they think of the goy as cattle?
Okay, I'm not going to respond to the goy's cattle. Goy is definitely derogatory, and I'm going to give you exactly the definition. The Talmud is the books of Moses. Hold on.
Jen's got some
Hold
history
on,
buff
hold
to
on,
think
hold
about.
on. Okay,
Sure.
so the thing about the Talmud is it isn't like the Bible or the Torah where it is some like chronology of events. The Talmud is actually a compilation of ancient teachings regarded as the sacred and normative by Jews from the time it was compiled until modern times. It's really about, it is fables. I think it is a lot of morality. It's teachings, but it is a compilation of teachings. I don't know if that quite explains it, but it isn't like a story, like a history story. Primary source of Jewish religious law and Jewish theology. So it's definitely based on the Torah, the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. That is basically what we're talking about when we say the Old Testament. I would say the Talmud is based on Torah and the teachings, but it also has things from later on. Like there's things in the Talmud that aren't that ancient. There are things in the Talmud that were added by rabbis and people later on that sort of like, I guess, further define Jewish laws. There's a lot of them. I really am not that interested in reading the whole thing, but yeah, that's what the Talmud is. And yeah, goy is derogatory. I always say Gentile. I always say Gentile. And people think that's strange that I say Gentile, but it's just so much easier and non-offensive. So that's what I say. Because the Bible says Gentile.
Well, the Bible is literal, so you better follow it.
Well, I just say, and as somebody who grew up Jewish, to us growing up, and again, I am much more aware now, but there were Jews and there were Gentiles. That was it. It wasn't like I made the delineation between Protestants, Catholics, and different Muslims and all that stuff. It wasn't like
Jen,
that.
you don't know what you're talking about. You have to make the difference between each and every segment of the population that is not Jewish.
Right.
If the Jews are the chosen people,
The
then
Jews.
everybody else is a non-Jew. And that is all there is to it.
I'm just saying, and I definitely grew up in a family that did use the term.
There are lots of terms that we use. We're allowed to use them. We are Jews. We are allowed to get away with them. We are not
There's
racist.
a lot of derogatory terms.
They're not derogatory.
Yeah, they are. They're just stop it.
We are simply explaining the truth.
He's trying to
about
be
the
Ben
regular
Shapiro.
We are just, excuse me, I'm talking right now, and when you interrupt me when I'm talking, it's not a good thing.
Oh
By the way, don't see the Barbie movie. It's really terrible, and it's totally
I'm not
anti-man.
liking your Ben Shapiro.
My Ben Shapiro is really good.
No, it's
So
not.
anyway, the Jewish people are the chosen people. They are perfect people, and everybody else sucks. So just remember that. And
Well, yeah.
remember, because I'm totally masculine. I can please my wife, and I can do all of these wonderful
Yeah,
things.
that's
Trust
what it
me,
is.
believe me. It's
So,
absolutely true.
like, my thought on it is that I can simultaneously be proud about being Jewish, because I am. I think it is really cool. I think it is cool to be sort of part of a history and a minority that has been through as much persecution and as much crap and has done so well. And I do feel proud about that. And by the way, my family were not the privileged Jews. Like my family were not those people. I'm the first person in my family that went to college. My family were all working class people. My dad grew up in like a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house with like 7 people in Miami.
But I think that's true of anybody, because as we've often said on this show, this is a class war. Everything becomes a class war.
Well, I just think oftentimes people somehow associate Jews with somehow wealth. And I do realize that now we do see that. We do see that now. But what I'm saying is that many of us were not raised that way.
Well, and again, I don't know how true it is for all parts of the United States. I don't know how it is in Los Angeles in particular, which has the 3rd highest Jewish population outside of
That's
Brooklyn.
where Jason grew up.
Well, outside of Brooklyn and outside of South Florida, Miami specifically, the biggest Jewish population in the country is in Los Angeles. And what I would be more curious to know is if it really just comes down to class, which in many ways, Zionism has a class construct in a lot of ways. Affluent Jewish people tend to be much more Zionistic than working class Jewish people tend to be. And I don't know if that's just reflective on territory or not.
Yeah.
But
I'm not sure. It also has to do with, there's also like this geographic thing as to how influenced a lot of people were by the Zionist movement and how effective it was back in the day when my grandmother and all of them were basically being indoctrinated and then passed it on to us, and how effective that was. And it obviously was much more intense in very, very, I mean, I grew up in an extremely monoculture Jewish community. I grew up, everybody was Jewish where I grew up. Like we, honestly.
Ray J, did you have to go there? Jen, will you tile the bathroom? I don't know if that's like a stereotype of some kind. I don't know what that means. What does that mean?
I don't know, but I'm beginning to think that Ray J must be one of Jason's friends that's wanting me to.
No, Ray J's friend of Stuck in the Middle, I think, of Cyrus.
I don't know. How do you know about the bathroom?
What does that have to do with the
I'm having issues in the bathroom, but how would somebody know I'm having issues in the bathroom? No, I don't want to tile the bathroom. I mean,
Rob, good to see you. Listen, the big difference between Cornel West and RFK is simply this: one has money in an infrastructure right now, and the other doesn't. So,
but is Cornell playing the win? He's playing for the movement. He's in it for the right reasons. If he can get 5%, that's a huge deal for people that are wanting third party to get federal funding. So do I think that he can rally a movement? Do I think he can push the needle? Do I think he could get people engaged and that it could really help down ballots and help pursue ballot initiatives and all sorts of stuff? Yeah, I think he's capable of firing up the people. And I think it's very important to support him. I don't care if you live, what state you live in. I really don't. I don't care if it's a when you're living in what do they call us now? We're not purple, we're red now. But when I used to be in a swing state, I mean, it's like I'm not going to be swayed by those kinds of strategies anymore. I support Cornel West because I support Cornel West. He stands for everything that I believe in, basically, and is coming at this from all the same reasons that I'm in this. So how could I support anybody else?
I think that's a great point. And the other thing we also have to remember regarding the primary process, and this is something that RFK did talk about this evening, I have been saying, it doesn't matter that the Democratic establishment, the DNC, is not going to be holding any debates. That's just the tip of the iceberg. They're literally rigging the election. So what have they decided they're now going to do? Well, funny you should ask.
They're going to put South Carolina first. Well, New Hampshire's not having it, though.
Oh, no, that's not it. It's even worse.
Okay.
So apparently now, because it looks like RFK is almost assuredly going to win both Iowa and New Hampshire, the Democratic establishment is now planning to remove President Biden from the ballot in both states. And by doing that, they are declaring it as a non-starter, and the delegates from those states will not count at the convention.
How is that?
So
allowed?
Don't ever say.
Wait a minute. How are our friends in Iowa standing for that?
I wouldn't stand for it. Both states are going to go red.
Well, but New Hampshire has already said they're having their primary whether we like it or not. It's in their constitution to do so. But we have had a lot of people on this show from Iowa. Iowa politics is loud and proud, and they are working and farm people. And I cannot believe that they're going to sit by and allow this to happen.
You know, everyone talks about how this country is going towards fascism and that we are completely losing our democracy. Our democracy has been lost.
Are you talking about India Walden?
Our democracy was lost a long time ago. And so now when you really start to peel back the mask and realize that there's no there. There was never going to be a fair electoral process. Now it's just shoved in your face because there is a sitting president who there is an attempted primary against. And what the Democratic Party is ultimately going to show as the days and weeks and months go by is that everything that they say is a reflection of what is the complete opposite of what they're doing. They claim that the Republicans are about suppressing democracy.
No. Yes, that's true too. Both things can be true is my point.
But the Democrats are about eliminating democracy altogether.
No, they like it unless it affects their little position. They like democracy for other things, but not for in-house. In-house, we decide what we're going to do.
And there is no justification. The idea that there is anyone who can look at the primary process, You know, I've said many a time.
Yeah, fire. Rob, there's no chance I'm supporting Joe Biden.
When you look at what has happened over the course of several election cycles over time, whenever a president is primaried within their own party, they always lose. But there's a reason, because that candidate is not popular.
That's the whole point.
At all.
So they're trying to pretend that that's not happening, but it is happening. And the fact that they think they're going to somehow cover up, I mean, you might be able to cover up some people. You're not covering up RFK. Like, that's ridiculous. And they're just going to come out looking really bad. They're making him more popular by trying to suppress him. They're creating almost a cult following. And I can totally see that happening. That it's sort of like what they've done to Trump. You know, it's like if you just keep like attacking it, and I'm not saying there aren't reasons, but it's like you really do create like this cult following for people.
You can throw all of your pomp and circumstance away by completely eliminating your historical relevance. You know, LBJ is a great testament to that, because he passed, you know, you can argue about the Voting Rights Act. I think that that was overrated in many ways, because there are so many intricate details that come from local elections, statewide elections, things that happen over that period of time. But he passed two significant legislative pieces, one at the end of his first term technically, and then the one after his reelection. He passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which ultimately thrust him into a landslide victory in the fall of that year. And then at the start of his 100 days in 1965, he
and
passed,
the party hasn't done anything for Black people since then.
correct. And then, of course, well, and again, taking advantage of the first 100 days of your presidency, what did LBJ do? He passed Medicare, which is one of the two most successful government programs in our nation's history, along with FDR's Social Security. And so as a result, he was flying high, but then he decided at some point that year that we got to go to war in Vietnam.
Okay, I get that. But I do note that he got those things done. He didn't blame the parliamentarian, did
No,
he?
he didn't. But
The parliamentarian wasn't an issue for him. You know, somehow he was able to, you know, power through that.
Where do you think Mitch McConnell gets his chops from politically?
Well, now he doesn't. Now he gets them from like.
Oh, he's not even there anymore. But he got them from LBJ. LBJ is the most successful Senate Majority Leader we've ever had, and he is somebody that if you ever want to just watch over time exactly why he was so successful, he was able to get things done, but ultimately threw it all away for that purpose, and that's why both Eugene McCarthy and RFK decided to primary him. And as a result of the New Hampshire primary, he decided to drop out. So that was ultimately the shot across the bow. Whereas the Democrats today are now saying, no, we're just not going to have a New Hampshire primary. We're not going to subject our president, who is super unpopular, to that circumstance.
I'm wondering if, and I'm sure that there are lawyers right now that are like trying to figure this out on behalf of RFK. But there has to be some sort of recourse against the party for pulling out of those states. Like there has to be some sort of, you know, penalty for this. That cannot be just like the okay thing to do. Not to mention, good luck to you ever winning back the people in Iowa again. Like, I mean, you already pissed off New Hampshire, I think, beyond belief.
58 years ago, we did get Medicare. Now imagine if we just expanded it to everybody and eliminated the for-profit middlemen.
That is more crazy than expanding education in other former years. We can't do that. We can't do that. We can't have that. We can't afford it. There's not enough tax dollars to pay for it.
Thank you, Travers. We really appreciate your support. And we appreciate all of your wonderful support for those of you that are here. And in conclusion, remember,
wait, we had something else to talk about, though.
We do.
All right, I have something else I want to shout out to.
If you are so inclined, please go to patreon.com/generational change. For as little as $5 a month, you can become a wonderful supporter of our amazing show. You know the Lulu sticker, it's the intro gift. Is the little lady here? Is she?
She's don't mess with her right now.
Okay,
she's finally settled and she's being annoying.
$10 a month Patreon, get yourself the Mansion Parliamentary bumper sticker. The No Labels Party is burning the midnight oil to get Mansion on the ballot. We were not wrong about this.
Tell you,
I thought it was a little bit of a joke at the time.
Well, I wasn't thinking of it from a No Labels Party. I was just thinking of it from just in my mind. But
if you are so inclined to become a $25 a month patron or just a $25 donor altogether,
you get the jersey.
You get the jersey. And so,
yeah, can I make my recommendation before I forget?
Yes, make your recommendation.
Okay, so guys, if you have any interest in really trying to understand what's going on in Ukraine, like really understand it from a real like analysis perspective from someone who is extremely smart and knows what they're talking about, Aaron Mate just interviewed John Mearsheimer on his show. I'd love to talk to him. He's brilliant. And it was like an hour-long segment, and they really get into it. And it is so smart and so well done. And I highly recommend that to anybody interested in learning what is currently happening in Ukraine. That was it. I don't know if you watched it, but it was really good.
I did not watch it. I do think, though, that one of the more important things that we all have to remember here is the president is woefully unpopular. And the fact that everyone is still suggesting that if Trump is the nominee, that Biden will still end up winning because the hatred of Trump is so great. I've tried telling you guys a million times, and many are still not hearing this. Donald Trump did not lose to Joe Biden. He lost to COVID. That's why he lost.
Biden barely won.
Barely won. And he needed to be at least a half a Bernie Sanders type president to ward off this growing unrest in this nation, this complete facade that things are okay, that things are good. They're not good. In fact, they're really bad.
They're really bad. And I also would like to point out that, you know, all these indictments and everything that Trump has done and all of his criminal stuff, and yes, it's disgusting. And I just want to say, like, here. Okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you. My thing is this: I wouldn't support him because I just wouldn't support him. I don't like him. I wouldn't vote for him. But if I were just looking at this from an objective standpoint right now, from where we are right now, I have to tell you, things that Joe Biden has done, things like the Willow Project, things like screwing the railroad workers, things like, I don't know, nominating people like Elliott Abrams, things like nominating, what's her name, Newland now to second in command to Anthony Blinken, Victoria Newland. Okay, it's like those things are so much more negative in terms of whether or not I vote for Joe Biden than Trump's indictments would be for whether or not I would vote for him.
Like,
again, I'm not voting for Trump. I'm just saying
exactly what it is that makes Joe Biden such a better choice than Donald Trump. You're effed either way.
He appointed Elliott Abrams. Like, the people that he is putting in power positions are Republican appointed people. He just put Victoria Newland. It's like that to me is a sign that he wants to up the war in Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely.
That's what that is. He wants boots on the ground in Ukraine. That's what that is. Because you bring in a war hawk like that, and especially someone who is so anti-Russia and someone who is so like into that propaganda, that's who he's appointing. And people like Elliott Abrams is a point of diplomacy. That is not somebody that I'm ever going to support.
Which is exactly why we need better choices in this country.
Which is why I like Cornel West.
We cannot, and again, even if you're in disagreement with RFK, the idea, first of all, most people that are probably in like what I would consider to be too far gone disagreement with RFK are probably people that don't even listen to what he says. So you've been given the directive by the establishment to not even entertain him, or even, I'm not going to ignore her candidacy, but Marianne, the fact of the matter is the mask is completely coming off now. This illusion that we get to elect rather than select our leaders of the free world. This is why Trump's presidency was such an anomaly, because he wasn't selected. And that completely threw everything into a tizzy. And they're trying to put the cat back in the bag. You're not going to do it because too many people in this country are unhappy with the system now. Putting little tweaks are not going to change that. And that's why it's important for you guys to understand why this particular story that just hit the news essentially today is so important. When we talk about
and for the record, I want it on the record that I loathe discussing Trump. Like, I wish I never had to talk about that. Not because I really hate him, because I really, honestly, they're all kind of the same to me, but because I'm just sick of talking about him. It's so boring to me already. It's just boring.
So the issue that they're now talking about is the fact that Trump has misappropriated campaign donations to pay for legal fees.
Well, he used them to pay off a bribe, so why would he not use them for legal fees?
Oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, like,
But what I think is amiss here, what I think a lot of people are not recognizing, is that the people who support Trump, their attitude is, okay, good. If that's going to keep him out of prison, then, you know, I'm happy to donate $50 to his campaign, $100 to his campaign.
none of these stories are taking away any of his supporters. None of them. It
No.
just makes him double down. Now, I don't think it increases his supporters. I don't think it increases his supporters.
Correct.
But I don't think any of these, I don't care what he's done. None of this, and no matter how much the Democrats and the other Republicans would like it to take him down, none of that is going to matter at this point. If it was going to matter, the first few things would have mattered. Like it's just, now we're just silly. Like that's why I don't care, because it's not going to do anything, and there's other important things to talk about.
This also comes back to what I've been saying, we've both been saying, that once people are fully aware of the system that they're living in does not actually work on their behalf, don't expect them to ever kowtow to the very individuals or groups within the system that benefit from it at their detriment to say, but this guy's a bridge too far. He's not a bridge too far. He represents a Molotov cocktail to the very system that they want to have destroyed. And I don't blame them. How could you? We have no health care. I mean, we really don't have any health care. We have a for-profit system that preys on people when they're desperately in need of help for their health care needs.
No, we have like sickness profit.
We do have sickness profit. In addition to that, we are now seeing, in the aftermath of what apparently was a supposedly good negotiation on behalf of the UPS workers to the Teamsters, is not actually a great negotiation.
Of course it isn't.
That, of course,
Told you I was
labor
reserving my opinion on that.
is definitely taking it on the chin. Although the labor movement is growing, it's not as cohesive as it needs to be in order to be effective. And that's why there's too many factions splitting people up and not recognizing that all labor must be united. One thing propaganda does very effectively is determine that if there is a slight political lean in the other direction by the members of a given union, such as police, truckers, even firefighters, kick them to the curb because they're on the wrong side. Their thinking is incorrect. So you must eliminate them. What you don't realize is that labor is united across all political thinking. It has to be, otherwise it can't succeed. It's been that way for many generations.
Oh, I would like to say, and by the way, I do think people should be held accountable legally and otherwise for their behavior. I'm not by any means suggesting that I don't think Trump should be held accountable. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. I'm just suggesting that none of this is going to affect him in any way politically.
No,
That's all I'm saying.
I don't think it
other
will.
than possibly help. And here's the thing is that I really believe that the stuff that Joe Biden is doing to really, or not doing, let's say, the stuff that he is basically not doing is causing way more harm to him than all of these things with Trump are going to harm Trump.
And then if you really want to take a step further, the fact that they're trying to completely upend the legal system on behalf of the president's son to get everything that he's been involved in swept under the rug. You had a federal judge that wasn't that I believe was appointed by Biden who looked at this and said, no, this is crazy. We can't do this. Because what you're asking them to do is completely change the way the law is interpreted to benefit their family, to benefit the president's son, to basically circumvent the legal process. And those people in this country who look at the treatment of, let's say, Hunter Biden, and then they see the treatment of Trump, and their attitude is, well, it really does look like we have two interpretations of the legal system. And you know what? It's probably correct. So I understand that mindset of, okay, so Trump's using our money for our legal fees, even though that's not what he said he was going to be using it for.
But again, if he used them to pay off the porn star, wouldn't he then also use to pay the legal fees to I just don't see how that's even news at this point. Of course he's using his money for that. He's never properly allocated, used, distributed funds ever. He has always done things like this. Always. In the entire history of his business life has been shady shit like this. Oh no. Oh good Lord.
Listen, I've heard about you talking about me for a while, but you called me shady.
Oh, you're shady.
If only I was slim shady, but I'm not so slim.
No, you're not.
Anyway, I
You're
wanted
very
to come on here
orange.
and excuse me, I'm talking. I wanted to come on here and explain something very important that you people would probably want to know. And that is, we are being treated totally unfairly, very unfairly, and I have to use these funds because my money is tied up in much more important things like my hotels, vacations, paying off other people. You know how it goes. And of course,
You don't pay your workers, like your laborers, your contractors. You don't pay.
they're just eternally grateful that they get to work for me. That is the real reward.
Yeah.
The real reward is knowing that you worked for the President of the United States.
Do you know how many
It's a good
times
title.
you've been sued? Because I actually looked it up.
It's totally ridiculous. They totally take it.
And I want everybody to understand this, because as somebody who is an attorney and understand like the absurdity of this, and this is something off the charts. He has been sued more than 1,000 times.
It's totally crazy. Can you believe they've sued?
I honestly, and I want to put, because, and the reason that this is so absurd to me.
It's absurd. No, trust me.
No, it's absurd.
Believe me, it is absurd. It's really.
You have been sued more than 1,000 times.
I have been persecuted.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
totally persecuted.
That's what it is. I want it
know,
noted.
I
I have
understand.
never been sued.
No,
Ever.
That's because you're not as important as me. Believe me, I am
Thankfully.
a very important person. And
Yeah.
That's what they keep coming
Yeah,
after
that's
me.
why.
No, that is totally why.
Because you're important.
No, I have, as I have said many times, I have done nothing wrong.
I know a lot of
whatsoever.
important people that haven't been sued.
That is for you to determine. But you're just a lawyer.
Yeah.
You're no. Listen,
I'm just saying.
Listen,
I think
you're
the
a
fact that you've been sued 1,000 times is just unbelievable.
I really should have you on my legal team. Listen, you're a lovely lady. You're an attractive lady. You're also Jewish. You're also a lawyer. How could I possibly go wrong by not having you on my legal team? You know, Jen, let's make the bargain right now. Let's do it right now. If I had you on my legal team, I could never lose.
You
I
can't
would get
afford
away
me.
with everything.
You can't afford
No,
me.
believe me, I totally can afford you. I'll make you an offer you can't refuse.
Oh.
It'll be the greatest,
Yeah,
most
you
incredible,
obviously
most
don't know.
beautiful offer. No, believe me. it'll
People
be
who
a
don't
good
know, I
one.
can't be bought because
It'll be
I just
great.
don't care about it.
No,
I
trust
just don't
me
care.
when I
I'm
tell
happy.
you.
I'm going to go live in my little camper.
You're totally
I'm a
not- no,
cannabis
you're
farm
totally-
and totally
You're
happy.
gonna have a choice. You can live at Mar-a-Lago or you can live on Central Park West, whichever one you want. Believe me.
I would
they're
live in
both great.
neither of those
No,
places.
you'll totally appreciate it. Have you seen all the gold that I have in my building?
Yeah, disgusts me.
You can literally eat off the floor. It's so clean. It's so perfect. I'm a germaphobe, as you know, so of course I make sure that
Disgusting.
things are clean all the time. So anyway, I just wanted to let the people know I'm extremely appreciative of all the money you've donated.
I'm
I put it to
disgusted.
really, really great use.
Yes, you have to
Believe me.
pay off hookers, extortion, and legal
Listen, they're not
fees.
cheap. I have very high. I have champagne taste. It's what it is,
Mm.
and I definitely use that money wisely. It's definitely worth it. Believe me. And so we're going to get through this. It's one step, many steps. We're going to keep kicking that can down the road. And pretty soon, I'll be president of the universe again. And when I am,
Oh, good
we
Lord.
will make America great again.
Again.
And I will definitely pardon myself. And that stupid Mike Pence won't be anywhere near that vice president spot. Who should I pick as my VP?
Well, the thought, who you should pick is Vivek, but you won't.
Oh,
And the reason you won't pick him is he is way too charismatic. He's young and he's like appealing, and you will not have anybody that might sort of upstage you, which is
Sounds
why
good.
you're going to have to go with a woman. And my guess would be somebody like Carrie Lake.
I think
but-
a really great Trump the Bit 24. It sounds really great.
That would be smart on your part to pick him, but you wouldn't do that.
Ramaswamy doesn't sound like a great name.
That's
I don't think I could use that name. Ramaswamy.
you won't like it as soon as he's more popular than you.
Well, he can't be more popular than me. The polls show otherwise.
I'm just saying he's very charismatic. He's very young. He brings in a lot of young people and different people.
I am the most beautiful gal at the ball.
Yeah.
believe me.
What I'm
I
saying
always
is
will
he
be.
will bring in an audience that you do not currently speak to.
That is definitely, totally, ridiculously
Okay.
bogus. Believe me, it's
Okay.
totally bogus.
Wow.
He understands that if he plays his cards right, he could succeed me after 24 into 28. I'll play along, and he is much better than Ron the Meatball Sanctimonious.
Well,
Much better than him, believe me.
he's
He's
imploding.
totally-
Oh, well, he's
Oh,
imploding.
he's definitely, his poll numbers are terrible.
Oh, it's imploding. I've never seen somebody raise so much money and inversely implode so quickly.
He should just give that money to me, endorse me, and go back to Florida, where he belongs forever.
Then what's he
Anyway.
going to use to pay his hookers and his legal fees?
Oh, I don't think any of those hookers want to touch him. He's a disgusting, baloney, terrible. I mean, I am the greatest human who ever lived compared to him, believe me. So great to see you all.
Mhm.
Make sure to support this really great channel because
Mhm.
they understand the importance of what I'm doing here. and you all have yourselves a great night, and make America great again.
Again.
Good night.
Yeah, you should be in prison.
Yeah.
So yeah, Trump is never going to.
Oh.
He's not going to suffer politically. If
No.
anything, it's only going to turn more people in his direction.
I just don't think it's affecting people either way. Whereas what Joe is doing every single day is turning off more and more people by the day. And what they're trying to do with the news cycles is to kind of keep that same pressure on Trump, to kind of keep turning people off from him every day, except for it's not having that effect. Every day that Joe Biden is president, he does something that makes me dislike him even more every day. So, you know, they're trying to do that to Trump with all this stuff. I just don't think it's going to have that effect. It's just not. So, and again, I don't like Trump. I'm not voting for him. I don't support him. I'm just saying, as the average person, the things Joe's doing is worse than all of these things about Trump. Because the stuff that Trump did, yeah, it's slimy, it's gross, it's corrupt, it's business, it's the kind of crap that they're all kind of involved in and doing. The stuff that Joe is doing is like, I don't know, screwing the environment, screwing indigenous people, screwing workers, I just feel like the damage he's doing is greater right now.
I think there's just a complete rejection of Western hegemony at this point. And there's a reason why you have these leaders in various parts of the world.
Oh,
that
Russia's
are
getting
now
all in
starting
Africa.
They're starting to get their sea legs, if you will, because the leadership, this is also one of the true downsides to having a president who really isn't in charge, who really isn't cognitively all the way there. And so there's this sort of vacuum that's being created in world leadership, particularly when you're talking about people like Putin and Xi Jinping, and now, of course, you're seeing some of the leaders, particularly the leader of Eritrea and Burkina Faso. And so,
No, it's okay. First of all, the name of the country is Eritrea. Okay, there's no N. The N is because the leaders, so they're putting it like as in a possessive. So the Eritrean and Burkina Faso leaders.
fair enough.
Okay, but the country is Eritrea. It's next to Ethiopia. It is on the Horn of Africa, which is on the east coast of Africa, and it borders Ethiopia and Somalia.
We also have to remember that one of the big problems here, this is again the disconnect of the American people, is that a lot of these other nations are not really concerned per se about what Putin is up to, because he's helping their countries. On top of that, most of the world hates NATO. Despite what the American people want you, or excuse me, the American powers that be want you to believe.
By the way, it's not just America. And I hate to use the term global north because it's definitely like friggin' like racist sounding, but like the countries that are the Eurocentric countries of the world have that, they put out that message and that propaganda, when in fact, the rest of the world does not like that. That's not. And by the way, this whole BRICS thing and this BRICS summit and this BRICS stuff, this is a big deal. I don't understand why more people aren't talking about the fact that there is this entire other creation of allied powers. And the one thing they seem to all have in common is a dislike for us. So the fact that that's not registering isn't making more discussion is very interesting to me. And when you talk about that and then you include Africa in the mix, because you have BRICS, the S is for South Africa. Okay, but you figure South Africa, they're often aligned. But now you have them bringing in other countries in the continent. And that's a big deal, especially when you figure out that how involved China is in Africa and the resources that are in Africa. It's almost they're all just getting set up and getting all their little ducks in a row so that they could tell us to go kick rocks, as you would say.
Yeah. And then, of course, you have the two, leaders of these nations, President Hickey, who has been in charge in, how do you say it again?
Eritrea.
For 30 years. Of course, again, another, dictator, wild leader of sorts, saying that the conflict is basically a war with NATO. Now, that's not entirely untrue. And the same is true for the Burkina Faso's interim president, Abraham Traore, who recently became one of the latest military officers to seize power in a coup in West Africa, publicly aligned with Russia. Well, let's see. You pretty much only have two choices when you are a, resource-rich nation, and one of the global powers is going to decide what to do with you. And in this case, Putin's doing something that smart leaders, whatever you want to call them, do. They make allies. They don't make enemies.
Now, if we're going to really talk about this, we need to talk about the history of this here, because our involvement in Africa, like what we call AFRICOM, and our military presence, specifically in places like the Horn of Africa, is so invasive and intrusive to these countries that it completely makes sense that they would want to align themselves with countries like China, who want to, yes, they do want to have their resources, and I'm sure there's something in it for them, but they're building up their infrastructure instead of just completely destroying them and basically trying to have coups in their country. China's not getting involved with it in that way. They're smarter than us. We like to bully our way through shit. But the thing is, I just don't see that that's gonna work. I don't think it's going to work. I think the BRICS thing is going to just kind of get bigger. And I think there are way more countries in the world that dislike us than do like us. Actually, nobody likes us. There's just some people that are stuck being aligned with us.
So when everyone writes these pieces, and of course that piece was written by Reuters, not a surprise. Reuters is not a publication that I think too highly of, since they seem to think that we steal their photographs.
They were threatening to sue us. If anybody wants to know why we no longer have a website, it's because we were being threatened to be sued by Reuters, and I honestly just cannot afford to get into it with them.
If you didn't know any better, you would think that the State Department wrote that article and have Reuters put it out on their behalf. So yeah, but it's six of one, half a dozen of the other. Just because we're critiquing the West doesn't mean that we're supporting Putin. It's like you're not allowed distinction. You're not allowed nuance.
No.
Nuance is key.
Well, I think it's really important to just sort of de-propagandize and just take it down to the skeletal facts of things. And we don't ever do that. The only quote unquote news and information we get is so loaded and even if it's actual factual information, because we do sometimes get factual information, they don't give you the context of that information. So they'll tell you, for example, we'll tell you X happened. And maybe X did happen, X very well happened, but it didn't tell you that A, B, and C happened, which led to X. So they leave out the whole part of the story, and that is the problem. So we have people fighting over completely different sets of facts. And it isn't that necessarily either side is wrong. In some cases, people are just wrong. But both sides could be right on their facts. Both things can be true at the same time. That is something that people fail to realize. Just like both teams can suck, two things can both be true, and it's not one or the other. We have this incessant need to have teams and dichotomy. I find it very frustrating and very small-minded.
That is for sure. And you're going to find out a lot more on Thursday. Time to be determined. I do have an event that I must attend, but it won't be.
I thought we're going at 8.
Well, we might. You might even be able to, but I do have an event that I have to attend. It's in the evening. It starts at 7.
Okay,
So,
this is going to not be a good thing for us to switch to Thursdays then. I can tell you that.
No,
now.
it's not.
That's when a lot of events are on Thursdays.
It's not a question of it being switched on Thursdays. It's a question of the starting time.
Well,
that's all. It comes
but
down
we
to.
have to go at 8, or we can't do what we're talking about doing. Because I'm not having them go at 10:30. That's ridiculous. So this is how it has to be if you want to go on Thursday.
Or they could potentially go first.
That probably won't happen. I'm just saying. But that probably
We'll work out
won't
the
happen.
details. And now, do me a favor. I have life stuff that I have to balance. It makes two of us.
I know.
So we'll figure it out. And yes, we can make Thursday work, and that's what'll happen.
Okay.
So anyway, on Thursday, we are going to be talking with Hannah Riley of Stop Cop City. So that'll be an interesting conversation. And, we're seeing the militarization of our nation all day, every day. And that's what's happening. So that is one conversation. Next Monday, you'll be speaking with Carol Anderson.
Yeah. Her most recent book is called The Second, and it's really an interesting historical analysis of the Second Amendment in reference to Black America, and how the Second Amendment was basically created to keep the slave population in line. There's just a very, very interesting history between those things. That's what we're going to be talking about.
We'll have lots of wonderful guests that will be joining us soon. So keep an eye out. We appreciate you all. Remember to smash that like button, subscribe, possibly become a patron, possibly chip in a Cash App. Any and all things that you can do is very much appreciated. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you Thursday.